All right, good friends, good evening and welcome. This is INN World Report Radio time here on the great Logos Radio Network. Sorry about the long intro tonight, but we had a little bit of last-minute adjustments we were making, but with good reason. And, well, let me just continue. My name is Tom Kiley, and welcome to the program. If I seem a little bit rushed, it's because we're going to get right into it. We will be joined momentarily by Dr. Webster Tarpley, who has not been on the show for some time. At least, certainly not since the coup d'état that happened in the Ukraine that removed a democratically elected government with a bunch of thugs backed up by apparently by the U.S. State Department. And you know Webster's going to have a lot to say about that, and he has been saying a lot about it. But I feel I owe it to the INN World Report listening audience to bring him here on this show so we can speak with him directly. It is, after all, an evolving situation. You are being given lots and lots and lots of official United States government propaganda on this. The very terms in which a lot of these events are being couched are loaded terms, are terms that are counting on the fact that you probably don't know that much about the region and what goes on there. For instance, that you don't know about the fact that the Crimean Peninsula was a part of Russia for most of the last 300 years or so, and that the Soviet Union gave the Crimea back to the Ukraine as an autonomous region back in the 1950s, I believe. And that most of the people there are ethnically Russian, speak Russian, and they don't want to have any part of this coup that happened. And so they voted to return to Mother Russia. Now, with a democratically elected referendum that was approved by something like 96%. Now, hold on to your children, because the warmongers in Washington have taken those events that I just described and have described it as Russia's grab of the Ukraine. Okay, Russia moves into the Ukraine. Russia takes the Ukraine. That's absolutely not true. The people there voted to rejoin Russia. Now, if the United States government's going to recognize as legitimate the illegitimate government in the Ukraine, which came into power without an election, how can they then tell us the desire of the people of the autonomous region of the Crimea, who have voted democratically to quit that illegitimate government? How can they tell us that was not legitimate? Anyway, those are the kind of things that we're going to be talking about when Webster joins us on the program tonight. I got a news flash from him, actually, an email from him this afternoon. As is typically the case when you have a putsch, that's the German term for it, for a coup. Oftentimes you're using guerrillas or, brown shirts, as they were called, the SA in Germany, the thugs that break heads and kill people and get rid of anybody who is in the way of the fascists that they are putting into power. But once the fascists achieve power, a lot of times these guys are no longer necessary, or in fact even a detriment, because they draw a lot of unwanted criticism and attention, and they're killed. And that's what happened in Nazi Germany. They called it the Night of the Long Knives, where Hitler's inner circle decided that they could no longer control these thugs, and that these thugs were, like true believers, who thought that they could run the show. So there was what they call the Night of the Long Knives. Well, there's evidence that maybe that's happening now. But you know what? Why should we talk about it in these terms when Dr. Tarpley is with us? Let's go live now. Good evening, Webster. Are you there?
Hello, Tom. How are you?
I'm fine, Webster, and it's been long overdue. We've been curious to hear what you have to say about this putsch in the Ukraine. What are you covering? What are you focusing on these days as far as that goes?
Well, first of all, the parallel that you've just mentioned, I think, is very important. The so-called Night of the Long Knives. Maybe people need to look back at the history of the Third Reich and Hitler and the Nazis. If you remember, that the brown shirts, the so-called stormtroopers or Sturmabteilungen, were the way that Hitler bashed his way to power in Germany by, clearing the streets of communists and workers and unions and social democrats or any other party, and that this was a group of thugs and criminal types, sociopaths, deviant personalities of all sorts. And that was called the SA, the Sturmabteilung. And there were a lot of people in the SA, notably their leader, a guy called Ernst Röhm, Roehm, who were talking about a second revolution. After Hitler seized power in January 1933, the SA wanted a second revolution. And the second revolution was, we are now going to kick out the heads of the banks, the companies, and the army, and we're going to take those jobs for ourselves. And Hitler felt that he wanted to keep the officer corps and the top industrialists and bankers on his side, and that he couldn't allow this second revolution. So he arranged for the murder, right, the machine gunning in many cases of the top leaders of the SA, including Röhm himself and a number of other people that Hitler wanted to get rid of. And that happened in July of 1934, so about a year and a half after the original seizure of power. And that seems to be what we've got going on already in Ukraine with the killing of this guy Muzychko. Muzychko is a well-known Nazi thug, and you may have seen him on television. He goes into government offices, beats up government officials, state prosecutors. His thugs have gone into the office of the head of the national television and beat him up and forced him to resign because he put Putin's speech on television. This Muzychko, by the way, is somebody who went to Chechnya in the 1990s and joined with the Chechen terrorists, right? The guys who blew up the Boston Marathon, paid for by Saudi Arabia, but they were killing Russians. And Muzychko thought that if they were killing Russians, then he had to go there. And he's accused of actually killing 10 or 20 Russian soldiers who were prisoners of war back during the 1990s. So this character is a monster. And he'd been running wild, and he'd been getting a lot of international attention. And he was just, according to most accounts, he was just killed today. And he was, of course, an important leader of the so-called right sector. And the right sector was the Nazi-fascist organization, which was the leading force in this Maidan, right? This public square that was occupied in the middle of Kiev by these street fighters and thugs most of the time. This guy Muzychko has just been killed, and there's still a member of that party, right sector. There's a presidential candidate who is also in the government. This character Yarosh, who is saying that the murder of that Muzychko's death was a murder, not a police operation, and that it was ordered by the interior minister, and the interior minister comes from the Fatherland Party. In other words, the Yulia Tymoshenko party. Maybe I just sketch this for a second. The people who now have power in Kiev are a group of kleptocrats and oligarchs oriented towards the IMF and the European Central Bank and the European Commission, right, the so-called Troika. And they are grouped around this awful woman, Yulia Tymoshenko, the gas princess, who is thought to be the richest and most successful oligarch of them all. And she was installed in power in 2004 by the Orange Revolution, a classic U.S.-backed CIA color revolution, masterminded in large part by the Brzezinski family, right? Zbigniew Brzezinski was the leading organizer, and his son Ian at that time. So Yulia Tymoshenko was the prime minister from 2004 to until about 2010, and she was then put in jail with good reason, because she was one of the most picaresque thieves that we've ever seen. That party is the Fatherland Party, and they're the big winners in terms of the posts, right? The president, the so-called president of Ukraine, installed by this putsch, as you say, is this Turchinov, and he's from the Fatherland Party, and the Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, this banker, and presumably a Scientologist also, but they simply represent the international bankers. These are the apostles of austerity and looting and having the U.S. and the European Union buy up the tremendously valuable Ukrainian Black Earth region and all sorts of other things that they want to loot. But you have that group. Those guys generally are in suits. Then you've got this sort of respectable fascist party. How can I say it? Not respectable, but they're not exactly the street hooligan type, right? These guys also appear in business suits, or can at least, and that's Chanibok and his group. They're the so-called Svoboda Party. But of course, the Svoboda Party grows out of the Social National Party or National Socialist Party of Ukraine, and they are the direct descendants of the SS, the German Nazi SS division called the Galicia Division, which was created to fight along with the Wehrmacht against the Red Army back in World War II. And they are especially fans of a guy called Stepan Bandera, Bandera being the leading Nazi collaborator of Ukraine during those years.
And somebody they've been trying to refurbish his image, even though he's been declared a war criminal, I guess, by the UN. Webster, hold on right there because we have to take a break. Friends, Webster Griffin Tarpley on the show, and as you can hear already, we're getting a very, very fine roundup of what's really going on in the Ukraine. We'll be right back with him just after this. All right, good friends. Welcome back, Tom Kiley, INN World Report Radio. Let's get right back to it. Dr. Webster Tarpley on the line with us. Dr. Tarpley, apparently this never-ending war on terror isn't enough for these neocons. They want to revive the Cold War as well. And but why don't we get back to it? You were giving us a little bit of the history and some of these players.
You're certainly right. The neocons, especially William Crystal, right? They're of course reviled and hated and execrated by the American people. Right? This plague, this I don't know what. They've inflicted these useless wars on the American people, right? Their hands are dripping with blood. They're the architects of national decline, and all they can do as one-trick ponies is to propose more war. In the past, the neocon virtue in the past was they would only want to pick on defenseless countries, right? Countries that were essentially unable to defend themselves. Now they're messing with Russia. This is very different. People should have no doubt. Russia can blow your head off any time. So don't mess with Russia. It makes no sense. You treat Russia like a banana republic. It's a nuclear banana. So be very careful, right? And it's time to run a few neocons out of town on a rail, or to reinstitute tarring and feathering or something like this, because this is simply intolerable. And we've been through it before, and now they're proposing to do it on a colossal scale. But the main weakness in the pro-war or interventionist argument, or this constant appeal to some kind of macho, schoolyard, infantile sensibility, is that the people who have seized power in Ukraine are Nazis. They are fascists. They are Nazi collaborators. They're friends of Hitler. They're left over from people who should have appeared at Nuremberg or otherwise, right? And of course, after World War II, these Nazi dregs passed into the camp of the CIA, and in particular, this Stefan Bandera, right, went to work for the CIA at Radio Free Europe and that complex in Munich, which I think the complex has moved to Prague in the meantime, but it used to be there for many years. And what Stefan Bandera did was international terrorism. In other words, he was masterminding assassinations of political and industrial and other leaders in the Ukrainian SSR for a good 10, 12 years after the end of World War II. So again, what you have today is a layer of people who are genocidal, to be sure, typified by this Yatsenyuk who came to the White House. They're generally, they're generally in business suits. Then you have this Svoboda or Freedom Party, They are the keepers of the grail of Stepan Bandera, and that's this awful Chanibok, who Chanibok has been the object of scholarly works. I mean, he's a case study for scholars interested in European fascism and neo-Nazism in the most recent decade. And this group, the Svoboda, has been condemned by the European Union in one of its forms for being anti-Semite, racist, ultra-nationalist. Nationalism, by the way, in the Russian-speaking area means something much uglier than it might to us, right? Nationalism, maybe not that bad, could even be good. But when you get that in the Russian Eastern European area, to be a nationalist is generally not a good thing. So you got this Svoboda, and they have a number of ministers in the government. And then the real hooligans, the not in business suit, actual street fighting Nazis, or this right sector, and that's where we have a guy called Yarosh, who is on the National Security Council. He's part of the group that oversees the police and the army. And then you've got Muzichko, who has just been liquidated, and a couple of others, right? This is a party, one of their guys, I think his name is Tarashenko, has called, as indeed Svoboda has called, for the nuclear rearmament of Ukraine. So you want to have a clique of fascists and neo-Nazis who would be armed with nuclear weapons. And that's what the State Department is backing. And the idea of it is this awful Victoria Nuland, right, this skank of the State Department with her dirty mouth, right? You remember what she said, blank the European Union, or obscenity verb the European Union. That's her. And at one point she boasted, the United States has invested $5 billion in this neo-Nazi apparatus in Ukraine, which she would call civil society. They're not very civil, though, public diplomacy and so forth. So you're seeing your tax dollars at work. The State Department, believe it or not, have chosen to try to create an anti-Russian opposition in Ukraine using this money. And, of course, what you're now looking at is the second generation of the 2004 color revolution, right, the Orange Revolution, which kicked out one group of, I suppose, kleptocrats, but put in another group of more aggressive kleptocrats who had, from the U.S. point of view, the benefit of being Russophobic, right? And that would be the group that's now represented by this awful Timoshenko woman, right? The one with the blonde braids. Although when she got out of jail, you could see she's not really a blonde.
She's a bottle blonde, apparently. Can I ask you a quick question, though, Webster? Correct me if I'm wrong, because a lot of people are waking up to this history now, and they're finding out about this neo-Nazi connection. But correct me if I'm wrong. This is a direct lineage right back to when the Nazis actually invaded Russia and the Soviet Union in 1941. It's an unbroken lineage through the Gehlen organization that was imported, as you say, into the CIA. And the CIA has been working with these people, harboring them, bringing them back to the States, keeping the dream alive, killing Russians with them, some 35,000 estimated by Frank Wisner. And it's straight on through to today. This isn't they just happened to bump into some neo-Nazis in the last couple of years, correct?
No, it is what the CIA used to refer to as the captive nations. Or there was something in the Republican National Committee called the Heritage Group. The leader of that was as an Italian from the P2 Lodge. He was an important guy at the Republican Party side. But basically, it's the Allen Dulles captive nations apparatus. And for Ukraine, a lot of that captive nations apparatus is still there. A lot of the people you see representing, Ukrainian world congresses or national congresses or other organizations with Ukraine in the title. Those are the CIA captive nations people, and this, of course, it's coherent with the entire approach of the CIA and the State Department to Russia, right? Which is, you have to give Putin his due. It's implacable hostility. It's an implacable hostility, which is simply the idea that Russia is the one country that's strong enough to say no. Russia, of course, is unconquered. If you look for unconquered countries in today's world, you come down to Russia, the United States, Great Britain, maybe. The other ones have all been overrun. And there's something special about the spirit of the ones that have not been overrun. And Russia definitely has this. And it seems to me, right now, today, I would like to make the case that Russia is in many ways in the right. Let me just make an excursus into that, if I could. I think people ought to be sympathetic to what Putin is trying to do. If you look at the last 25 years or so, you see something that you don't find in history that much, which is a period of more or less total world domination by a single power. You had it maybe when Spain dominated the world from about 1530 or so until about 1650 or 1660. But there was always some kind of an opposition, right? Be it from the Dutch or from the French or whoever it was. And what you see today, since the fall of the Soviet Union, it was a tragedy. Putin is right. It absolutely was a tragedy because it went too far. It didn't need to go that far in terms of the collapse, right? The Soviet Union could have gotten rid of the Baltic states and some of the Caucasus states, and the rest would have been happy to remain. And there were no movements, right? There were no national liberation or national independence movements. That stuff was all top down. It was all the oligarchs and the nomenclatura in Kiev and in these other Union republics who said, we'll save ourselves by playing the nationalities card. So this went too far. And the result has been, it has brought out the very worst, the absolute worst in the United States, like these neocons.
When it could have brought out the best and said, okay, we're the last one. Let's settle this peacefully and fix it so there are never any more unipolar powers. But let's talk about that when we get back. Webster Tarpley with us. Quick break. We'll be right back with him just after this. All right, good friends. Welcome back. Bringing home the bacon, that song. And that's exactly what we're doing tonight. Dr. Tarpley on the line with us. We have not had him back on the show since the putsch in the Ukraine. And that's what we're talking about. Webster, before you go back into this great, all these connections to history, could we talk just for a second about the neocons, who are back on the ascendancy, appears in Washington after being trounced with their bad advice about Iraq and so forth. Now this Victoria Nuland, they're back. Susan Rice, Kerry, all this stuff. And they're getting us into they're trumping themselves. Terrorism is not enough anymore. They want to revive the Cold War. Where does this Victoria Nuland come from?
Well, Victoria Nuland individually comes from a very interesting family. Her father is a doctor, a medical doctor, and unfortunately I don't have this reference right in front of me, but you can look him up. He's the author of a book called How We Die, and it is a detailed and rather gruesome description of what it's like to die in various ways, right? From cancer, from a heart attack, from other things, a stroke, whatever it is, right? How you die, what it's like. What it feels like, what it looks like, what's going on, and so forth. And this father of hers turns out to have been a physician, and as soon as he got his medical degree, which I think he got from Harvard, he fell into a deep depression and he was considered for a lobotomy, but then had repeated applications of electroshock. So that's the world that she grew up in, and his father, her grandfather, was a guy who died of chronic syphilis. So that's her family tree a little bit. And, of course, now she's married to Donald Kagan. Have I got the right Kagan? No, maybe it's Robert Kagan. I can't keep these Kagans separate. I believe Robert Kagan. Robert Kagan being the top foreign policy advisor to Mad Dog Romney in the previous campaign, the guy who taught Romney to say that that Russia was the greatest geopolitical adversary of the U.S. And you'll remember that there was in the Romney campaign that was already a regroupment of the neocons. Thank God we don't have Romney. We'd already be at war with Syria, with Iran, and with Russia if we had Romney, based on what they said. And you remember even Ryan got a neocon handler, Dan Senior, the former spokes for the occupation of Iraq, and we had Robert Joseph. We had others, right? Famous neocons, maybe of the second rank, who have now striven up to the top rank. Anyway, as soon as you have geopolitical trouble, the neocons smell the opportunity for promotions, appointments, professorships, money, prestige, get back on TV, all these other things. And that is simply what's going on. Somebody like Danielle Pletka of the American Enterprise Institute, who was, they put her on C-SPAN once or twice, and she was practically hooted down, right, because of her disgusting antics in the run-up to the Iraq War, right? People remember these things with great bitterness, but they now feel re-energized, and they're making a comeback. And you can see that inside the State Department and other institutions, there are enough neocons who have, remained in place so that they can now come out. And also, they hate Russia. In other words, they have a deep, abiding hatred. Remember, in 1992, Paul Wolfowitz wrote this study saying that Russia would remain a deadly enemy. This was the only country that could resist the United States and inflict, severe physical damage on the U.S., blow the U.S. up, in effect. And he said that's unacceptable. So they're always going to be an enemy simply because they can say no. So this is extremely unwise. What you need in international affairs, and this may not appeal to young people, but this is the sum of my wisdom after quite a few decades of looking at this. You want to have approximate balance. The fact that the U.S., that the others have been so weak, frankly, right? I would criticize the rest of the world. Why did you let yourself get so weak? What fools you are, because you've let the U.S. run wild. You've accepted this unipolar world. Putin is one of those who didn't want to accept it, but had to operate within it. And now I would say the events of the past 6 or 8 months have gone very far towards replacing this very lopsided unipolar world with a more balanced system where you've got the U.S. and the NATO people and Japan on one side, but then you've got this group that is going to take shape around Russia, I guess, as political leadership on the other side. And certainly there have been problems on the Russian side too. You had a whole group in Russia around Medvedev who were inclined to accept the unipolar world, right, and simply do the best they could within that. Anyway, right now, the simple summary of the Ukrainian crisis is...
Well, one second, Webster, before we... Hold on, Webster,
yeah.
Before we totally vacate the point, you were starting to tell us a little bit more about the neocons. Where are they from, actually? They go all the way back to Trotsky or the Germans? Where is this philosophy? I know Leo Strauss is the head that people know about.
Yeah, take a look at my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA. And what you'll see is that the ultimate source of the neocons are people who call themselves the conservative revolution. It's a term coined by Hugo von Hofmannsthal, who was the librettist for the operas of Richard Strauss, I guess. The conservative revolution. What does that mean, conservative revolution? It means right-wing reactionary radicalism that does not orient towards traditions or conserving anything, but rather wants to create a new monstrous world, quite apart from any tradition. And this is why it's so wrong to call people like even the Republican Party. They're not conservative; they're reactionary, and many of them are proto-fascist. So it goes back to Carl Schmitt. Simple description of him: Hitler's lawyer, Hitler's legal expert, the guy who defended Hitler when he was sued or put on trial or whatever it was for various things. That's Carl Schmitt. And he had an admirer who happened to be Jewish and therefore couldn't go far in the Nazi world. This was Leo Strauss. And Carl Schmitt got Rockefeller grants for Leo Strauss to come over to the University of Chicago and some other places, I guess St. John's of Annapolis, but mainly at the University of Chicago, where he became the ideologue of this neocon school, right, where people like Wolfowitz and many others came out of it. Now, it's a whole spawn, right? It's a pervasive academic or quackademic network. So they're there, right? And they're now coming out of the woodwork. But let me just get back to
the irony being that many of them are Zionists and are identify as being Jewish, yet they apparently have their roots so close to Adolf Hitler through Hitler's lawyer. As
that's right, isn't that interesting? It shows that many of the ideological categories are fraudulent. But reality is that there's an affinity of these neocons for these Ukrainian fascists. The irony being the Ukrainian fascists are some of the most outspoken anti-Semites you're going to find anywhere in the world. I would also point out, when you look at somebody like Barroso, the head of the European Commission, right? What's his affinity? Well, his lineage is back to Portugal under Salazar. In other words, this other kind of fascism that was going on in Portugal. And from that Salazar fascism, we also get the current wife of John Forbes Kerry, right? Teresa Heinz Kerry comes again from the world of Salazar fascism in Portugal. So things are not what they seem. But look, from the Russian point of view, what does it mean? You've been invaded by Napoleon. You've been invaded by Hitler. Where do the invasions go? Well, they go through Ukraine. They go through Belarus, right? White Russia. That's under, I think, a pretty firm hand with Lukashenko. But Ukraine is this typical area that has swung back and forth. Right? It's been fought over. Think about Alsace-Lorraine between France and Germany, right? Going back and forth, part of France until 1870, then part of Germany until 1914, then part of France, then part of Germany, on and on, now part of France. Get the idea? It's an area that's been fought over, swung back and forth.
It's a buffer zone, a buffer state. Hold on, that music means we got to take a break. Right back with Dr. Webster Tarpley, friends, author of Synthetic Terror, 9/11, Synthetic Terror, and many other books. We'll be right back with him just after this. All right, good friends, welcome back. Now, we've got about 2 more segments with Dr. Tarpley, so let's get right back to it. Webster, I think we sort of ran down some of the history, and these neocons are back in the saddle again and not content with an endless war on terror. Now they want to revive the Cold War.
Let's not overdo it. Look, I would just point out a couple of things, right? By now, everybody knows that Obama is more or less a bum, right? He's more or less incorrigible. He's a sellout. He's a Wall Street Democrat. He's a Wall Street puppet, and so forth. But when you look at what he's done, right, concerning Syria, he got himself to the brink of a pretty serious war, and Putin threw him a lifeline, and Lavrov. And somehow Obama had at least the sense to come back from the brink. And I think that's where the neocons went wild, because they thought they already had a war guaranteed, right? That there was going to be the bombing of Syria, and that was going to blow up the Middle East. And, with their obsession with Israel and so forth, they thought this was highly desirable. So the neocons have been berserk since last September, right? And we also know in the meantime that supposed gas attack was not at all the work of the Syrian government, and perhaps something of a mystery, but certainly no reason to bomb Syria coming out of that. So I think in that case, Obama, he saw that the Congress was against it, that the American people were against it, so he backed off. And similarly today, right? 56% of the American people say the most important thing with Ukraine is don't get involved. The most important thing is not putting up a strong front against Russia. What is this stuff? This, are you going to let Putin get away with it? This is absolutely infantile, right? This is crude, stupid, adolescent, macho nonsense, right? Who cares? Can you imagine? I would urge people to go and watch that movie The Day After, right, with Jason Robards, where Kansas gets blown to kingdom come by ICBMs. Take a look at that, and then look at the face of Yatsenyuk and Yarosh and Chanibok and ask yourself, is it worth it? And you're going to say, no, it's not worth it. Well, or better yet, get your children or grandchildren in front of you, and then get the portraits of Chanibok and Yatsenyuk and ask yourself which means more.
Isn't it worse than that? Webster, isn't it even worse than that when we say, who cares? This isn't something that was going on in and of itself, and now we're saying, who cares? This is something that half the brain that's hidden from the American people created. And the American people are saying, who cares?
Absolutely.
It wouldn't even be happening if Victoria Nuland hadn't invested $5 billion in it, would he?
Yes, and she has been, Strobe Talbot, going back to Clinton. She was in the State Department in the Strobe Talbot era, as he wrote about the other day. But remember, this is an apparatus, right? This is it started around 2000 in the present form with the overthrow of Milosevic in Serbia by a color revolution. And then it went on to all kinds of places, right? Notably Georgia with the Roses Revolution and the Orange Revolution in Kiev, the first round. And then they tried the Cedars Revolution in Lebanon, and Hezbollah was powerful enough to stop them. But look, what you've got to do is take a look at a certain number of organizations that have channeled the $5 billion in there. The first is the National Endowment for Democracy. This should be abolished. No more public money. That is an area where not a dime of taxpayer money should go to those people, because that is a joint production of the Republican and Democratic parties, and its only purpose, the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, Project Democracy as it's sometimes called, is to meddle in the affairs of other countries, increasingly in favor of fascism. And I wrote about this already 30 years ago, right, in 1985. How ironic that they call themselves Project Democracy, and yet their job is to spread what we can only call fascism. So no money for the NED. No money for the parts of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, that fund, civil society or fascist development. And then take a look at these other groups like Freedom House, right, in New York City, the old Leo Chern networks. They receive U.S. money, no more. Take a look at the Albert Einstein Institute in Cambridge, and this lunatic Gene Sharp claims to be, a continuer of the nonviolence of, various people in the past. He's none of that. He's a torpedo for the U.S. State Department and so forth. So defund this apparatus, right? Don't let more billions go to fascists. And remember, you look at these people in Russia like Navalny or Kasparov, right? The chess champion, Garry Kasparov. That guy, Garry Kasparov, works hand in glove with a guy called Limonov, who is a Russian Nazi. A Russian Nazi calls himself a national Bolshevik, and he's racist and reactionary and so forth. And even this Pussy Riot, these people, they have elements of xenophobia and very sinister kind of right-wing sounding slogans in their family tree. So,
and Putin put a stop to this stuff, didn't he? Didn't he get castigated because he said no more of these American NGOs running around in Russia?
Yes, right. How can you allow foreign agencies to send money in for subversion and destabilization and agitation inside of a sovereign country? That's one of the big gripes about Ukraine, is that you had a parade of Western and U.S. politicians, including the famous warmonger McCain, but also Senator Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, and others who came in there, and they cavorted in public with Nazis, anti-Semites, and so forth. And somehow there ought to be something to pay for at the polls. But anyway, remember, the way that this whole thing came about is the attempt to create a fascist coup and a fascist anti-Russian government in Ukraine is simply a threat to Russian security. And you can think of, if there were a fascist anti-American coup in Mexico City, right? Wouldn't the U.S. respond to it? Of course they would.
Funded by the Russians to the tune of $5 billion, and they get to put Russian army bases right across the Rio Grande afterwards.
Exactly, and they're going to take away a chunk of what used to be, take away Florida or something like this, right? So I think you have to see it from the Russian point of view, and it's not unreasonable at all. Now, what ought to be done here? It's unfortunate that it's gone this far. There was an attempt at a negotiated solution on February 21st, which was backed by the Polish foreign minister, the French foreign minister, and the German foreign minister. And those guys turned out to be complete liars and complete frauds. And this is why the era when Russia will expect or value diplomatic deals with the West is over, right? The deal was vote for the Libya resolution and we'll simply have, protection of internal minorities. And then it turned into regime change. So that was bad enough. And now recently in February, you get the top diplomats of these important Western European countries saying, let's sign up and, we'll cool it in the public square. We'll have elections. And then the fascists of right sector essentially were on their way to murder this unfortunate Yanukovych. Yanukovych is chicken Kiev. Huh? Yanukovych is somebody who sent his police out there to be hit with Molotov cocktails without guns. And the idea of sending unarmed police into that kind of a meat grinder, that is simply just irresponsible. And he earned the title of Chicken Kiev, right? He should have cracked down and imposed law and order much sooner. Any government, any normal government in the world would have done that. But now, what's the answer to all this? Well, I'm glad to say that both Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski agree that Ukraine should not be part of NATO. You want to commit your children to fight and die for that Nazi clique in Kiev? You want to tie the United States to that kind of a political operation? Surely not. So no NATO membership, and rather you can call it whatever you want. You can call it neutrality. You might want to call it Finlandization. Finlandization meant that Finland in the 50s and 60s did not join NATO, did not join the European Economic Community, and generally committed itself to have governments that were not raving anti-Soviet governments, and even indeed to suppress political parties that wanted to do a raving anti-Soviet propaganda. So that would be the key. Ukraine could be a bridge. It could be a buffer state. That would be I think its essential vocation, given the realities of the world. But to accept this role of neutrality, or again, you can call it Finlandization. The other thing on the inside is a federal system, or indeed a confederal system. In other words, a very large degree of regional autonomy, and sort of each group minds its own business. You've got the group in the west around the city of Lvov, Lviv, Lemberg in German, Leopoli in Italian. That's the center of the Nazis, I'm afraid. This is where Bandera and company had their stronghold. When the Nazis arrived in 1941, Bandera did a pogrom. He slaughtered a whole bunch of Jews, hoping to win the admiration of the Nazis. It didn't quite work for him. But that's an area which is Western-oriented, speak Ukrainian, and they're Greek Catholics. They look to the Pope. This is an embarrassment for the Pope, by the way. He doesn't need such people. But that would be one group. Then the East will Russian.
Well, you know what, Webster, the music means we're heading into break. So we have one more segment with you, correct?
Yes.
That'd be great. I'd like to also, when we come back, Webster, if we could talk a little bit about, post-coup Ukraine. What are the organizations of civil society behaving like? How are the police doing? How is the military doing? I hear admirals defecting to the Crimea and that sort of thing.
Oh yeah,
let's talk about that when we get back.
The whole officer corps is defecting to the Russians.
Very good. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Webster Tarpley, one more segment with us. We're going to take a top-of-the-hour break. We'll be back with him after these messages. All right, good friends. Welcome back to Theme Song to the Avengers, a 1960s TV show. Of course, we've got our own Avenger, our historical Avenger, Webster Tarpley, with us tonight. And we actually have a little more time than we thought, so we're going to have a couple of more segments with Dr. Tarpley. Webster, and don't forget, friends, you can go to tarpley.net. You can get all this great information that Webster's talking about. He's got a lot of archives of his own talks there. His books, so many of them, really, really good. History about Mitt Romney, of course, 9/11 synthetic terror, a must read.
Ron Paul is an aspect of the Romney campaign.
That whole cohabitation is documented there as well. And so, Webster, before we continue, I just want to throw in, keep in mind, I'd like to touch on that whole thing going on with the Ukrainian military when you get finished with this walk down history here.
The institutions the thing we can say in short about the so-called Ukraine is that nobody's fighting for it. Right? Nobody seems to want to put their lives on the line for this Yatsenyuk, Turchinov clique in Kiev, right? The Kiev fascist clique. Nobody seems to want to fight and die for them. So certainly Americans should not. And I'm fed up when I see, the Ukrainians say the U.S. left them in the lurch. What do you mean? You're not fighting. You expect the U.S. to fight when you're not fighting? It's like Kuwait, right? That was another great example, right? The Kuwait army ran away, and the U.S. had to go in and get people killed. So enough of this, right? These were wrong to begin with. But look, just to get the solution on the table, and here's the solution. The place needs to be neutral. If you join NATO, and I see even Jeffrey Sachs, who I usually disagree with and condemn, right? The guy who actually helped to destroy Russia in 1991 and 1992. Jeffrey Sachs is on the Morning Joe today saying, if you let NATO take in Ukraine, then that's going to be a world catastrophe. And that's exactly right. And the more people who know that, the better. So good that Kissinger and Brzezinski both say NATO should not have Ukraine as a member, but let it be neutral. Let it not. Unfortunately, the European Union is practically the same as NATO, so no European Union either. But and they're not even being offered membership, right? They're being offered a kind of associate status, which is the same as Mali or Ivory Coast or someplace like this, right? They're not really being treated as a European country. They're being treated as a colonial outpost. So don't do any of that. And then have a confederation of the principal parts, right? It's really East and West. The West, once again, being Greek, Catholic, subjected to the Pope, right? This is the so-called Uniate Church, right? The Unia of Brest in the 1590s, masterminded by the Jesuits. Okay, that lives on. I would appeal to Bergoglio, Pope Francis, to get those guys to cool it. The authority of the popes over those uniates has not been what it should be over the years. That would be another interesting study. But this is obviously one group, and their capital would be this Lvov or Lviv or LWOW or Lemberg, whatever you want to call it. And then the East, which is heavy industry, right? The Donetsk, Donbass, right? One of the great heavy industrial regions of the world, and it could still be. And these cities that you see, Donetsk and Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk with the big dams that you used to read about years ago, and some other places, right? Lugansk. Anyway, probably the Dnieper River down the middle of Ukraine would be the dividing line between these two districts. And as you were saying during the break, you can call them cantons, you can call them states. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, right, had a dual system, right? That the defense and foreign policy were one thing, but the individual states, right? There was an Austrian part and a Hungarian part. And as we were saying before, if you put together the idea of a neutral country, which is multi-ethnic, right, and then also make it a confederation, what do you get, right? What's the leading example? You were telling me before.
Yeah, at least 3, maybe 4 languages. Switzerland, and very autonomous cantons.
Catholic, Protestant, right? Coming out of the wars of religion, because that's what it came out of. So that could be a successful model. And there are other successful models of countries that were multi-ethnic or strong divisions inside the country, different languages, different religions, whatever it was. So you could have Ukraine as neutral and confederal. And that is essentially what the Russian Foreign Ministry said the other day, right? That they wanted to propose constitutional reforms for Ukraine. But of course, this would also mean that these fascist scum like Yarosh, and now Muzichko has gone to his reward, but these other people, there's a guy called Parubi. Parubi is the head of the National Security Council, and he is one of the founders, I think, of the Svoboda Party. So he's one of the top Nazis. And when they put him in the newspaper here, They don't tell you Nazi leader. They say, leader of the democratic new Ukraine. Well, no, he's not that. So this would be an example. Now, the underlying thing, though, is economic crisis, because the energies that you see unleashed in this Maidan and the availability of unemployed young men to go there in certain numbers, this is only thinkable in terms of an economic breakdown, which is what we continue to have in the world. We are, after all, in a world economic and financial depression, which started in 2008 and which has continued. And that is why things fall apart. The world crisis that you see, with all these manifestations, upheavals in so many countries, going through the ringer and collapsing in some cases, the only way to explain this or to understand it is that these are symptoms, ultimately, of this world economic breakdown crisis. So you got to deal with that. In the case of Ukraine, the obvious thing is east-west trade and east-west infrastructure for trade, right? The traditional problem was that during the Cold War from 1945 until 1990 or thereabouts, almost half a century, the east-west connections were neglected, right? The rail links went north-south, but not east-west. Similarly for the energy corridors, similarly for other kinds of energy. There were some exceptions, right? The Russians had built some gas pipelines already in the 70s with much opposition coming from U.S. warmongers and others. But the obvious future of Ukraine would be to become precisely this bridge between East and West. And when you say bridge, it means they've got to have fast rail, maglev rail. They've got to have electricity grids going through there. They've got 18, I believe, nuclear reactors. Chernobyl was in Ukraine. And if you don't want that to be repeated, you've got to rebuild those reactors, right? They've got to be modernized, build new ones, build fourth-generation high-temperature pebble-bed nuclear reactors to replace the ones that they have, and then let them sell that energy to these unfortunate countries like Germany that have decided not to have any more, and Italy's still in that same group. So the place could have an upswing, and then you look at this Donetsk, Donbass, right? The area in the Don River Basin, all the way in the east. That's where you have these huge coal and steel capabilities, which could be an important part of rebuilding the world, right? Obviously, you want to maybe de-emphasize the coal and get the scrubbers on there and whatever else, so you don't have people dying of lung cancer. But the idea is certainly clear that this could live again. So that would take investment.
It sounds like you're going against the whole economic union of Europe, though. Aren't they like smashing all this stuff up? Aren't they driving Greece into the ditch? Aren't they going to drive the Ukraine into the ditch?
Yes. Well, that's why you can't.
This sounds great, but how come the Europeans aren't doing it?
Well, you can't because the European Union has become this neoliberal monetarist monster, right? It's an engine of austerity and imposing the worst predatory forms of speculation, derivatives, and other completely parasitical forms of gambling, right? And calling that investment. And the European Union was successful in the earlier decades because it had very strong elements of social democracy, pro-union. Things were built into it strongly. It had a responsibility to raise standards of living, especially in peripheral areas, right? And it also had a strong Catholic social doctrine input, and that's all been swept away. And this gets me back to my question about Putin. The real wages in Western Europe and the United States were higher when the Soviet Union was strong. And it simply, from the U.S. point of view, or European too, it was the ruling classes of these Western countries did not feel free to act out their predatory greed, selfishness, and rapacity in regard to working people, because they knew that if they pushed that beyond a certain limit, that working people might say, well, I'm so disgusted with Wall Street or London or Frankfurt or whatever it was, let's see what these Russians have to offer, right? Let's see what these Soviets have to offer. Let's see whether the commies have anything that might help us, right? So this was always present. There was an alternative. And if you look at
that's really important, Webster. That's the reason for the American middle class to come, and it's the reason for the American middle class now to be squashed down because there isn't that alternative, isn't it?
Well, certainly the creation of the U.S. middle class in the New Deal, I think it starts from a desire to build the American middle class. But the fact that certain powerful banking groups and so forth had to cool it to a significant degree was this awareness that, again, if you really went overboard and you really allowed it all, the inner pig to come out or the inner wolf, then there might be a backlash, and you might be, find yourself dangling from a lamppost somewhere. So there was that, right? And the fact that the Soviets collapsed, that's where you could say, Putin, you're right. The collapse of the Soviets was a tragedy, and U.S. real wages have been falling more rapidly after that than they were before that. They were already falling. But after 1991, we've got this terrible intellectual climate and so forth. So that's the problem with the European Union. But this is another reason why I would say countries that are in the European Union ought to stay there and fight the monetarists of the European Central Bank. But Ukraine should not go joining the European Union because this will be interpreted in Moscow as really a backdoor to NATO. So don't do it.
And we should fight the monitors right here. But let's talk about that maybe in the next segment. We're going to take a quick break. Dr. Webster Griffin Tarpley on the line. 9/11, Synthetic Terror, and so many other great books. Tarpley.net is where you can find all that. We'll be back with Webster right after this. Friends, welcome back. Webster Griffin Tarpley on the show. We have not had Webster on since the overthrow of the democratically elected government in the Ukraine. Lots of propaganda. Boy, if we could touch on some of that, the foaming at the mouth here in the Western media. But in any case, let's get back to where we were. Webster, you were talking about some possibilities on how to go forward.
Well, again, the main thing is Ukraine is a country that ought to be neutral. It ought to be confederal. It should have these two autonomous zones. It should have the maturity to see that given the realities of the world, this is such a sensitive area that it's unwise for them to have these wild, hysterical, violent, anti-Russian parties. It simply makes no sense, right? It's a recipe for their own grave sorrow, right? Because you're going to have a hell of a time, right? You're going to be militarily mangled by the superior power of Russia, whatever else happens, and it includes nuclear weapons. So there's got to be enough maturity, and the U.S. should take the lead by cutting off the funding through the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and these front groups, right? The NGOs like Freedom House and whatever else, right? So they should all back off. Now, what you see instead, I would call it a collective psychosis. It's a psychosis of Russophobia, where people seem to have taken leave of their senses, right? We've had this trail of tears through the Audis, right? We've had Afghanistan, we've had Iraq. This was, futile, horrible, nightmarish, and this is nothing compared to what you have in Ukraine. Ukraine is infinitely more dangerous than anything in the Middle East. I don't care what it is. Not the Israelis. Nobody else can match the danger inherent in Ukraine because you've got Russian troops potentially coming into the east with nuclear weapons, Polish troops, say, coming in from the west, backed up by NATO and the U.S. nuclear deterrent. So the one place in the world where you can get a direct clash of two nuclear superpowers is Ukraine and Belarus and maybe these little Baltic states where the Nazis are also very much in evidence. But they seem to have remained somewhat calmer, although they have explosions of Russophobia from time to time. You look at somebody like Kerry, you look at Susan Rice, and you have to say these people are nuts, right? They're collectively insane. Now, again, this is where I would have to say Obama a bum, but not the worst bum, because what he did was avoid the war with Syria. And now, when Yatsenyuk came to the White House, it was my expectation that Yatsenyuk would raise the demand for an immediate NATO membership of Ukraine. And when he came out, I was watching closely when Yatsenyuk came out of the White House, and he said nothing of the kind. He made some nasty remarks about the Russians, but that was it. So it looks to me like this demand might have been made by Yatsenyuk, but denied. You also have this cryptic statement by Professor Stephen Cohen, Russian studies expert. I've criticized him in the past for his love of Nikolai Bukharin, going back, again, 20 or 30 years. But Professor Stephen Cohen, on this issue, well above the average, and he came on this Chris Hayes, MSNBC, and said when Yatsenyuk got to the White House, he was talking crazy. The White House gave him a history lesson, and when Yatsenyuk came out, he was not talking so crazy. He was somehow muted compared to the way he went in. Now, I don't know what that refers to, but I would assume that this character, Stephen Cohen, right, the husband of Katrina vanden Heuvel, of the left wing of the U.S. intelligence community and The Nation magazine, that he has, this is some kind of an internal readout, right, some kind of a readout that the rest of us don't get to hear, and that somebody had told Yatsenyuk, cool it, Sonny, because, you know, and probably also, don't start shooting Yatsenyuk, right? You start shooting, you're on your own. We're not going to be with you. We don't have an alliance with you. We owe you nothing. And you're not fighting, right? So something like this. So I think that went on. You also have the Wall Street Journal says that around the 5th to the 10th of March, Ukraine demanded emergency military aid from the U.S. under whatever, and that was denied. No emergency military aid, no immediate infusion of guns or rockets or vehicles or communications or intelligence or anything like that. And Obama in San Diego, 10 days ago, said very clearly there will be no military option. That's very different from Bush. Bush always ran around saying the military option is always on the table. Here's Obama saying the military option is not on the table.
Well, it was easy for Bush to say he wasn't butting right up against Russia either. Let me ask you something real quick, though.
Through this the Georgia crisis of 2008, there was, remember, Cheney wanted to bomb Russia. He proposed, he said, look, the Russians have to come through this tunnel. We'll bomb the southern edge of the tunnel, and the Russians won't be able to reinforce their peace.
Cheney wants to bomb everything. But listen, though.
But this is documented. This is in the book.
Right. Now, listen, it's so clear. This is such a dangerous situation. And these neocons, surely they know that. So are they just trying to punish Putin for ruining their show in Syria? They're going to take it to a certain point and that's it? Or are they, is it something more Strange-Lovian? Do these people really want to push it and, have a nuclear exchange thinking that we can come out on top?
Well, I don't know, and I don't want to find out. In other words, how crazy are the neocons? Let me count the ways. Then you get into this area, 1914, 2014. There are elements of miscalculation on the part of some in 1914. The British clearly wanted a world war. There were people in Russia in 1914 who wanted a world war. There were people in Vienna who wanted a regional war. There were all kinds of people. And I'm sure we have God knows what today, but
isn't that sort of like the case today?
I'm not the shrink of any neocon.
I understand, but I mean, if it's ultimately going to be, if one set of oligarchs is going to run the whole show, Russia has to be dealt with, China as well. And is this like, let's get it over with now before they get a chance to form a bipolar world again?
Let's step back from this, from the psychological approach, but just say, we've had these moments before. For example, the Spanish Empire dominated the world, as I said, from winning the Italian peninsula in about 1530 or thereabouts until about 1650 or 1660. The loss of world domination by the Spanish Empire was something called the 30 Years' War, which I've written a large academic book about. And that, of course, was proportionally the worst war in European history, with about, 1/2 to 1/3 of all the people in Central Europe getting killed. That was the 30 Years' War. That was the fall of Spain and the coming of France. Then France manages to dominate most of Europe from about, say, 1655, 1660, the so-called Peace of the Pyrenees, until the War of the Spanish Succession and the Treaty of Utrecht, or Utrecht, about, 1710, 1715. So there you have a period of French domination, but this is constantly challenged by the Anglo-Dutch, by William of Orange, William of Mary, then of England, and this attempt to bring down Louis XIV and to defeat him. So there's another big war, right? The War of the Spanish Succession is one of the key causes of the French Revolution many decades later, but the horrible sacrifices of the French peasantry. Okay, then you get a period of British domination from, 1712 until, it goes through the Napoleonic Wars. During that time, France still exists as a challenger. But then in the Napoleonic Wars, Battle of Trafalgar, British get world naval supremacy, and the British dominate the world until the 20th century. And the breakup of the British Empire is your two world wars, World War I and World War II. Now we've had about 25 years of U.S. domination. Will the decline of that turn into a world war? That's the question.
Well, it's getting a lot faster. One more segment with Dr. Tarpley. We'll be right back with him just after this. All right, good friends. Welcome back, Dr. Webster Griffin Tarpley. Webster, this is your last segment with us. I know you have to run. Anything you'd like to say to wrap it up?
Well, I just urge people, given the fact that you ought to be able to see, if you're not blinded by hatred or ideology or libertarianism or Rand Paul or whatever it is, you got to notice.
Or phony baloney left-wing politics.
Fine, but yes, there are left-wing warmongers, right? The warmonger left, the pro-war left, is the heritage of the Obama administration. That's for sure. But those people, the MSNBC lineup, that's corporate, right? That's really the voice of General Electric and other defense contractors. But if you look at the profile of Obama, Obama is being reviled by neocons, libertarians, and all sorts of people for not being a warmonger enough. And I think this is exactly what the American people want, at least to some degree, right? Don't get involved. Now, the poor American schmuck doesn't know that the fascist coup was financed by the U.S. and set up by Victoria Nuland and this guy Pyatt, P-Y-A-T-T. Another neocon is the U.S. ambassador, and this neocon, these neocon vermin that we have running around the State Department and indeed the CIA doesn't know that. But the healthy instinct of the American people is to say, we want no part of this. And you look at Obama, he's really interpreting that desire as much as I think he can. In other words, I think if you look at some of these
Webster, that you bring up a really important point here. Kerry ostensibly works for Obama. Rice ostensibly works for Obama. Nuland ostensibly works for Obama. Obama is saying no. They're all saying, what's wrong with you for saying no? Who's in charge here? Who ran this thing? Whose idea was it? Did Obama have to sign off on this project or what?
Look, remember all of the stuff that we said about the secret government, the parallel government, the invisible government, the deep state, the rogue network in the 9/11 era. All of that is still there, right? You can see there's a constant purging of the military by Obama as much as he can to kick out lunatics, right? To kick out fascists, golpisti, people who Putschists who want to have a coup, right? And then there's that whole Benghazi, right? What was Benghazi? Benghazi was an October surprise in September to install Romney, get Obama out, and go on some kind of a rampage of aggression. And thank God it didn't work. So it's not unusual to see that the bureaucracy does what it wants to do. And in particular, this color revolution bureaucracy that I'm proposing to defund and wipe out and mop up. That has a life of its own, right? That, as you were saying, that goes back to the 1940s, right? That goes back to the Galen organization making a deal with Alan Dulles, right? And it's an international thing, and you'd have to be a much stronger personality than Obama to take that on and wipe it out. So it continues, right? Although again, I think if you see this constant firing of proto-fascist generals and subversive generals and admirals and so forth, you can see that the Obama administration does do some things in that regard. But of course, he's very weak, and he's a tool of Wall Street, and he's weakened himself by proposing all of these austerity sellouts. So he's left there. But again, the thing that I find deplorable is so many libertarians and Ron Paul freaks who somehow they want to demonize Obama and blame this on him. I don't see it. If anything, the role of Obama in this has been to put the brakes on a whole bunch of other people that he's got around him that he's afraid to fire. Sure, and when Kerry came in, I think I was one of the very few people saying, "Oh my God, Skull and Bones is back, and that's Kerry, and look, this is going to be awful," and it has turned out to be horrendous, right? In those terms.
Yeah, so, it's sort of like Hillary Clinton on steroids, it's even worse.
Hillary Clinton on steroids. So I would urge people, identify the people who are the most aggressive warmongers and attack them. And that's not Obama. I'm sorry. Whatever people's hatreds, resentments, or God knows what prejudices may be, Obama is not the leading edge of this. Obama is, again, more like somebody who's trying to throw a certain amount of cold water on it, right? Today he says, I'm going to support NATO, but there will be no use of force in Crimea, right? That's from the current New York Times online. So focus on the warmongers, right? Get Kerry out. Get Susan Rice out. Get Nuland. How can Nuland still be in the State Department after that, explosion of F-bombs that she was taped as dishing up, right? This kind of stuff, right? These are the people who need to be ousted. And then also remember, though, that the only way you can create an organizational alternative to this is not by supporting some damned Republican. Like you can see Rand Paul, right? Rand Paul at the beginning of the crisis was cool to the military action, but then as the Republican Party became more and more hysterical, Rand Paul was pulled in their direction. In other words, Rand Paul has gone quite a few steps in the warmonger direction as a result of this stuff. So open your eyes and figure out that this is not adequate. And you're going to have a mass movement, which is not primarily on foreign policy, but on domestic. And that is anti-austerity, roll back the cuts, preserve the social safety net, tax Wall Street, 1% Wall Street sales tax, and seize control of the Federal Reserve, job creation, right? Credit creation for job creation. We need 30 million jobs. So you got to have a global alternative. And the reason it has to be global is what I'm trying to say is the U.S. ruling class, the Anglo-American ruling class in general, are once again mad as hatters, right? We've seen it in the past. It has ups and downs. Sometimes they're calmer. Sometimes they have episodes. Sometimes they go into remission, right? We've seen it. They're not monolithic, but right now is a very, very ugly phase because there's something about Russia that simply drives them nuts. And this means that this ruling class cannot be allowed to rule. They've got to be ousted. They've got to be, put out to pasture, retired, whatever it takes. And that's a much bigger challenge for people than to say, well, my approach is to vote for Ron Paul or something idiotic like this.
Well, Webster, we're coming down to the end of the segment here. Very interesting as always. I'm with you. I can't stand much that is Obama, but I have to give him credit, grudgingly or otherwise. He put the brakes on after being, I guess, duped or fooled or maybe even enthusiastic about Libya. When he saw how that turned out, he did put the brakes on Syria. And I think a lot of what we see going on in the Ukraine is in retaliation for that, both against him and Putin, causing trouble. And he seems to be having a level head. What the heck kind of military anything could you do in the Crimea anyway? Even if you wanted to?
Well, there was, in the 1850s, there was something called the Crimean War. If you're going to attack Russia anywhere, the Crimea is where you're going to attack because it's a peninsula. There's a like a causeway, a tiny spit of land between the Russian mainland and the Crimea, and then at the other end you have the Strait of Kerch. So it's practically an island, and this is where the British and the French and the Turks attacked in the 1850s, right? This is the Charge of the Light Brigade.
Brigade.
Balaclava and Sevastopol and all this other stuff. So it's an avenue. It is also an avenue of attack, right? In addition to the Ukrainian landmass. So you can understand the historical concern. There's also this other question, right? That Russia starts there, right? The so-called Kiev Rus of 988 AD. That Grand Duke Vladimir is the first ruler in Russia who converts to Orthodox Christianity. And the Kiev Rus is the start of everything Russian. Moscow.
Well, it's going to have to be the end of our segment with you here, Dr. Tarpley. Godspeed. I know that you have another appointment, but it's been too long. Can we hope to have you back on the show in the next 4 weeks?
Thank you so much, Tom. Best of luck to you.
Thank you, Webster.
And thanks to your listeners.
Well, thank you for coming on. Tarpley.net. We'll talk a little bit more about that. That's this for that for the segment. We'll be right back with one more part of the show.